The encounter. Jessica's shift at the hospital had been grueling. The fluorescent lights above her flickered intermittently, casting an almost eerie glow over the sterile walls of the emergency room. She had just finished taking care of a particularly challenging case, a young woman who had been in a car accident, her body battered and bruised. It wasn't the worst of days, but it had certainly worn her down. Her feet ached with the strain of standing for hours, her muscles sore from the constant movement. It was nearly time to clock out. All Jessica wanted was a warm shower, the comfort of her couch, and the peaceful silence of her apartment. She needed to rest. The last 12 hours had drained her more than she'd anticipated. As she walked toward the hospital's back exit, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty hallways, she glanced at her watch. It was almost 8 p.m. It had been a long day, and the night air outside would feel like a welcome reprieve from the hospital's oppressive atmosphere. But just as she pushed open the heavy glass door leading to the parking lot, she heard something, a low, almost inaudible groan. She stopped dead in her tracks, her heart instantly on alert. She scanned the area, half expecting to see a fellow nurse or a doctor finishing up their shift, but the area was empty. The hospital's back exit was dimly lit by a single flickering streetlight, casting long shadows across the ground. There was a faint breeze, and the cool night air sent a shiver through her, heightening her senses. Another groan. Jessica's gaze was drawn to the corner of the building, where a hunched figure lay motionless on the pavement. Her first instinct was to call for help. But she hesitated. She was tired, so tired. She'd been on her feet all day, running from one emergency to the next. Surely, someone else had seen the person. Someone would take care of it. Her rational mind tried to convince her to keep walking, to just get in her car and go home. But the deeper part of her, the part that had pushed her to become a nurse in the first place, refused to let her ignore the suffering of another human being. Sighing, Jessica walked towards the figure, her shoes clicking softly against the pavement. The closer she got, the more she could see. The man's clothes were ragged and torn, his once dark jacket now faded with dirt and wear. His face was half covered in grime, his unkempt hair tangled and matted. His eyes were closed, his face pale, but his chest heaved with labored breaths. The sight of him pulled at Jessica's heart, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in the pit of her stomach. The man's condition was bad, but what could she do for him? She wasn't equipped to treat someone in this state, and surely, the hospital had a team that could respond quicker than she could. But then, she saw it. The man's arm was twisted in a way that suggested a break, and his leg was bent at an odd angle. Blood was pooling beneath him, staining the ground a dark red. Her instincts kicked in. She knelt beside him, gently brushing away the grime from his face to get a better look. His skin was cold to the touch, and his pulse was weak, but there was a pulse. He wasn't gone yet. "Sir, can you hear me?" Jessica asked, her voice soft but filled with urgency. There was no response, only a faint groan that escaped his lips. She checked his breathing, shallow, but steady for now. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands moved automatically, checking for more injuries. The man had suffered some kind of head trauma, his forehead was swollen, a gash just above his eyebrow that had bled out some time ago. Jessica pressed her fingers lightly against it, assessing the damage. He needed help, immediate help, but there was no time to wait for an ambulance. She quickly reached for her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. As she spoke to the dispatcher, explaining the situation, she noticed the faintest flicker of movement in the man's face. His lips parted slightly, as though he was trying to speak, but no sound emerged. "Hang in there," she whispered, as the dispatcher confirmed that help was on the way. Jessica's mind raced as she continued to assess the man's injuries. There was so much more going on beneath the surface, she realized. The man wasn't just an ordinary homeless person. There was something about him, something that felt off. His clothes, while filthy and ragged, didn't quite match the usual attire of someone living on the streets. He wore an expensive-looking leather jacket beneath his layers, though it was scuffed and worn down by the elements. And then, as she reached to check his pulse again, her fingers brushed against a piece of metal hidden beneath his clothing. A small, rectangular device, the size of a wallet, was clipped to his waistband. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. It looked like some sort of advanced technology. Was he a businessman? Or perhaps someone involved in something far more complicated than he appeared? Her heart skipped a beat. Something didn't add up. "Sir, can you hear me?" she repeated, but the man's eyes remained closed. She tried to ignore the cold creeping into her bones as she waited for help to arrive, but her mind was too busy, too unsettled by the bizarre situation unfolding before her. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. She allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but it was fleeting. The unease gnawing at her gut wouldn't go away. The ambulance screeched to a halt, and the paramedics rushed to the scene. The lead paramedic, a man named Marcus who had worked alongside Jessica for years, knelt down beside her. "What have we got?" he asked, his voice steady. "He's in rough shape," Jessica replied. "Broken arm, possible concussion, severe blood loss. He needs immediate care." Marcus nodded, directing his team to lift the man onto the stretcher carefully. Jessica stepped back, trying to catch her breath as the paramedics worked quickly. As they loaded the man into the ambulance, Jessica's gaze lingered on his face for a moment longer. There was something about him. Something familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She tried to shake the feeling as she walked back to her car, but it clung to her. Why had he been out there, alone and barely clinging to life? Why had no one else noticed him before now? Her fingers brushed against her phone again. Should she call someone? Find out who he was? No. The paramedics had him now. It wasn't her place to follow up, was it? She didn't even know him. But as she started her car and drove off, the lingering sense of recognition tugged at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just encountered someone far more important than she could have ever guessed. She parked in her driveway, her body aching as she grabbed her things and stepped inside her apartment. But even as she locked the door behind her, the image of the man lying on the pavement haunted her. There was no escaping it. Who was he? And why did she feel as if her entire world had just shifted on its axis? For the first time, Jessica wondered if she would ever be able to forget the stranger she had helped tonight. Something told her that this was only the beginning, and whatever came next would change everything, unraveling the mystery. The days following the encounter with the mysterious man blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and questions that gnawed at Jessica's mind. She couldn't stop thinking about him, the homeless man who had appeared out of nowhere, wounded and in desperate need of help. She had seen countless patients over the years, some of them homeless, some wealthy, but this one, there was something about him that she couldn't shake. Her usual routine at the hospital was demanding, but it had become almost comforting in its predictability. Yet, every time she passed a shadowy corner of the parking lot, or glanced at the discarded papers in the emergency room, her thoughts wandered back to the man. His face, pale and battered, was etched in her memory. The strange, advanced technology hidden beneath his clothing haunted her. She had never seen anything like it. Despite her growing curiosity, Jessica tried to push the thoughts aside. There was no point in obsessing over a patient she'd never see again, right? She had done what she could, called for the paramedics, helped him as much as she was able, and then she had gone home. But still, something lingered. It was late one evening, 2 days after the incident, when Jessica's curiosity got the better of her. She had just finished another long shift, and as she left the hospital, she found herself walking toward the back exit again. The same corner of the parking lot where she had found him. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though something was pulling her forward. She wasn't sure why, but something told her to check up on him. Perhaps she was just being a nurse, wanting to make sure that a person in need was taken care of properly. Or perhaps she was seeking answers. The parking lot was quiet, the night air crisp and cool. The soft hum of the city in the distance seemed far away, as though the world had muted itself for this moment. Jessica walked towards the spot where she had found the man. The ground was empty now, a few scattered leaves tumbling across the asphalt in the breeze. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at her intensified. It felt like she was walking into a riddle she couldn't solve, and she couldn't resist trying to figure it out. As she stood in the dim light, looking at the same spot, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her messages. She had almost forgotten about the ambulance report, but the image of the man kept coming back to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that his identity had to be somewhere. Patient, unidentified male, age approximately 40. Severe head trauma, multiple fractures. Treated and transported to St. Andrew's Medical Center. Condition, critical. That was all the hospital report said. The man was still in the system as unidentified, despite his injuries being extensive. Jessica frowned. Why hadn't he been identified yet? Surely someone, family, friends, even the police, should have come forward by now. She thought about what Marcus, the lead paramedic, had said when they transported the man to the hospital. His face looks familiar, doesn't it? Almost like we should know him. At the time, Jessica hadn't given it much thought. But now, the words replayed in her head. As she tapped the screen to call Marcus, her phone buzzed with a notification, a new message from the hospital's emergency room staff. It was a quick note from Dr. Carter, the head of the ER, stating that, patient 409, the man you treated, is awake and asking for you. Her breath caught in her throat as the words hit her. He was awake? After 2 days? And he wanted to see her? Without wasting another moment, Jessica called Marcus. Hey, Marcus, it's Jessica. I just got a message. The man I helped, the one we brought in, he's awake. They're asking for me. Yeah, I saw the note. He's been asking for you by name, too. Really strange. I thought we'd already gone over everything, but he's different. It's hard to explain. He keeps saying things that don't add up. Jessica's heart raced. What kind of things? There are some inconsistencies in his story. He's got a head injury, so it's possible he's disoriented, but it's almost like he's hiding something. And his body? It's healing at an unnaturally fast rate. I've never seen anything like it. Fast healing? Jessica repeated, her voice thick with confusion. How fast? I'm telling you, he's been in bed for less than 2 days, and his leg, broken, looks almost completely healed. Same with his arm. That's not possible. We've been running tests, trying to figure out what's going on. Jessica's mind raced. This didn't make sense. Okay, I'm on my way. The hospital room was quiet when Jessica arrived. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed gently, casting a sterile glow across the white walls. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The man, Tom, as the hospital had called him, lay in the bed, propped up by pillows. His appearance had changed drastically since she had first seen him. His face, once pale and bruised, now looked strangely healthy. The swelling had gone down significantly, and the faint scar on his forehead was barely noticeable. His eyes were wide open, alert, and startlingly clear. For a moment, Jessica stood at the door, unsure whether to approach. She had never seen someone recover so quickly, especially someone in the state that Tom had been in. It wasn't possible. She glanced at the charts hanging at the foot of his bed. His heart rate, his temperature, even his blood work, all normal. Too normal. In fact, his readings were even better than they had been before the accident. Tom turned his head slightly as Jessica entered. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, and he smiled. "Jessica," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Thank you." For a moment, she was frozen. He sounded different now, almost as though he were speaking through some kind of barrier. But it was his words, the clarity in his voice, that unsettled her. "Of course," she replied slowly, her voice shaky. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he said, as though that word alone could explain the whole situation. "But I need to talk to you." Jessica took a cautious step forward. "What is it? Is there something wrong?" "I need to tell you who I am," he said, his voice serious now, his eyes locking onto hers. "You might not believe me, but I need you to know." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. This was the part she had been dreading. Something inside her told her that she was about to learn something that would change everything. Tom took a deep breath. "I'm not who you think I am. And I'm not supposed to be here." Jessica blinked. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, the door to the room opened, and a figure stepped inside, Marcus, the paramedic, looking uneasy. He glanced at Jessica, then back at Tom. "Is everything okay in here?" Marcus asked, his tone a bit too casual. Jessica turned back to Tom, but his face was unreadable now, his eyes clouded over with something dark. "I think I'm about to find out," she said softly. Tom's lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. "Then," he said it, "I'm not who you think I am, because I'm someone you've been looking for." The words hung in the air, like a heavy weight. Jessica's mind began to race, trying to process everything he was saying. What was he talking about? Who had been looking for him? What was he hiding? And why did she have the sinking feeling that her life was about to be turned upside down? The revelation. Jessica's heart raced as the room seemed to close in around her. The words Tom had just uttered reverberated in her mind, leaving her speechless. "I'm someone you've been looking for." The weight of those words pressed on her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Who could he possibly mean? She had never seen him before this strange encounter, and certainly, she hadn't been looking for him. Her mind worked frantically to make sense of his cryptic statement. Could this be a mistake? Marcus, still standing in the doorway, seemed to pick up on the tension in the room. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. Her eyes darted between Tom and Marcus. I'm not sure," she said quietly, her voice shaking. She stepped closer to the bed, her gaze never leaving Tom's. "You said you're someone I've been looking for. What do you mean by that?" Tom exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting as if searching for the right words. "I know this is hard to believe. But everything I've told you so far isn't the whole truth. I'm not a random homeless man. I wasn't just wandering the streets." His voice lowered to a whisper, as though he was afraid someone might hear. "My name isn't Tom." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't Tom. That was the name on his hospital records, the name they had been calling him for the past 2 days. Who was he, then? "Then who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. She was losing her grip on the situation. There was something surreal about this entire conversation. She had been a nurse for years, calm in the face of emergencies, steady in the chaos of the ER, but now, she felt like a fish out of water. Her instincts told her that something was deeply wrong. Tom glanced around the room, as if ensuring they were alone. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, and Jessica could sense the weight of whatever secret he was about to reveal. "I'm someone who's been, well, someone important. Someone who disappeared a long time ago. Someone who has been erased from history." Jessica frowned, not quite understanding. "Erased from history? What do you mean? Do you remember the disappearance of the scientist Dr. Elijah Walker?" Tom asked, his voice calm but edged with an intensity that was almost alarming. The name hit Jessica like a punch to the gut. Dr. Elijah Walker. She had read about him years ago in a journal article. Walker was a brilliant mind, one of the foremost experts in biochemistry and nanotechnology. He had been on the cutting edge of groundbreaking research, creating advancements in regenerative medicine that could change the world. But then, he vanished. The news stories had been filled with speculation. There were rumors of government involvement, conspiracies surrounding his research, but no one ever found out the truth. The disappearance remained one of the most perplexing mysteries in modern science. Many assumed he had simply vanished on purpose, gone into hiding. Jessica had never imagined she would meet someone who claimed to be Dr. Walker. Her mouth went dry. Dr. Walker? Are you serious? You're Dr. Elijah Walker? Tom nodded slowly, his face grim. I am, or at least I was. The man you knew in the news reports is no longer the same person. That man, he died a long time ago. I am something different now. Jessica stumbled back a step, trying to process the magnitude of his words. Dr. Walker had been one of the most brilliant minds of his time, but his disappearance had always been shrouded in mystery. And now, here was this man, claiming to be him. But how? Jessica managed to ask, her voice cracking slightly. How is that possible? If you're really Dr. Walker, why are you here, in this state? Why were you on the streets? How? Everything that happened to me, the way I disappeared, it's part of a much larger story, Dr. Walker interrupted, his eyes darkening. And it's a story that hasn't finished yet. I've been running for years, Jessica. Running from people who want my work, my research. They would stop at nothing to get it. And they have already come close. Too close. Jessica stood frozen in place, her mind racing. She had always known there were dark corners of the world, places where knowledge and power collided in dangerous ways, but hearing this man speak about being hunted, being erased, made her blood run cold. People are after you, she asked softly, almost unable to comprehend what he was saying. What are they after? What have you done? Dr. Walker's expression hardened. It's not what I've done, it's what I've created. I've discovered things that could change the course of human history. Things that could revolutionize medicine, biology, and even humanity itself. He paused, his gaze flickering to the window, as though he were searching for a way to continue. And that's why I had to disappear. If they found me, they would use my research for their own purposes. People are always looking for ways to control others, Jessica. They would have used my work to create weapons, to manipulate lives. I couldn't let that happen. Jessica felt the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just a case of a missing scientist, it was the story of a man who had literally been erased from existence in order to protect the world from the misuse of his discoveries. Her heart pounded in her chest as she processed the gravity of what he was saying. I was part of a government project, Dr. Walker continued. A secret program designed to create advancements in human biology, nanotechnology, genetic modifications. We were looking for ways to extend life, to heal the body from the inside out, and to change human potential. But someone with much more power than we had, saw the potential for misuse. They forced me into hiding. Jessica's breath hitched. So that device I saw on you, was that part of your research? What did you do to yourself? Dr. Walker nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of regret and determination. Yes. The device is a prototype of something I created, an implant that can accelerate the healing process, regenerate tissue at an incredible rate. It's the result of years of work, Jessica. But it's not just a medical device. It's also a tracking device. I've been followed for years, watched from the shadows by those who want to use my work for their own gain. The technology is too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. And I know too much to let them silence me forever. Jessica felt her head spin. The man in front of her, who had seemed like a random, broken stranger just days ago, was actually one of the most important figures in scientific history. His research could potentially cure diseases, reverse aging, even reshape human life itself. And now, he was telling her that he had been hunted for years, forced to hide to protect his work from those who wanted to exploit it. "You don't know the full scope of what's going on," Dr. Walker said, his voice steady now, though there was an edge to it. "I've seen things, Jessica. Things that could destroy everything you think you know about the world. People who would stop at nothing to get my research. And the truth is, I'm not safe anymore. They've found me. They'll come for me, and they'll come for anyone who's close to me." Jessica's heart skipped a beat as a chill ran down her spine. You think they're coming after me?" she asked, the words barely leaving her lips. Dr. Walker didn't answer immediately, but the look in his eyes said it all. And in that moment, Jessica knew that her life was no longer her own. She had unknowingly crossed a line, and there would be no going back. Her world had just shifted into something far darker, far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The chase begins. The weight of Dr. Walker's words hung in the air, and Jessica's heart pounded with an unsettling sense of dread. She had no idea what kind of trouble she had stepped into, but she could feel the enormity of it pressing on her, making her breath catch in her throat. Dr. Walker's eyes, once filled with the exhaustion of a man in hiding, now reflected something far darker: fear, urgency, and the knowledge of a reality that she couldn't even begin to grasp. "What do you mean, they'll come for me? Who is after you?" Jessica finally managed to ask, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Dr. Walker's gaze flickered to the window again, his expression hardening. "I don't know how much time we have. They've been tracking me for years, but I thought I had more time. I thought I could lay low for a while longer." He sat up straighter in the bed, his movements swift and deliberate, as though every second counted. "They won't stop. They'll come after anyone who's connected to me. And you, Jessica, you're now a part of this. Whether you realize it or not." Her pulse quickened as she tried to wrap her mind around what he was saying. "You're telling me I'm in danger now? Because I helped you?" He nodded grimly. "You need to understand something. This isn't just a case of medical curiosity or secret government projects. This is about power. Those who want my work, the technology I've created, are willing to do whatever it takes to get it. And they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stands in their way." Jessica's stomach churned. Her instinct as a nurse had always been to help, to heal, to protect. But now, she had unknowingly become part of a story that stretched far beyond the walls of a hospital. "How do you know they're after you? How do you know they're even aware of where you are?" Dr. Walker's expression darkened. "They've been watching me for years, Jessica. But I've always been able to stay ahead of them. Until now." He paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "When I disappeared, I thought I could bury myself. But what I didn't realize was that they had a system in place to track every step I took. And when I started to work on this new technology, the implant you saw on me, they began to close in." She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "You're telling me you're being hunted by some kind of secret organization?" "Yes," Dr. Walker said, his voice low. "But not just any organization. These people are far more powerful than any government. They have connections everywhere: private contractors, militarized groups, even corporations with global influence. They control information, resources, and they're determined to take what's mine." Jessica's mind was reeling. It was impossible to believe, but every word he said rang with an unsettling truth. She had seen enough in her years as a nurse to know when someone was lying or hiding something, but the look in his eyes, the sheer desperation, told her that Dr. Walker was being completely truthful. Her breath hitched as another realization struck her. The device, you said it's a tracking device. If it's implanted in you, doesn't that mean they know exactly where you are? He nodded slowly, his expression grim. Yes. And it's been activated. They've been waiting for the right moment to move in, and I think that moment is now. A chill crawled up Jessica's spine, and the silence in the room became suffocating. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she processed the situation. She was just a nurse, a woman trying to do her job and live her life, but now she was wrapped up in something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. And it was clear that her involvement in Dr. Walker's story had only just begun. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to move quickly, Dr. Walker said, his eyes flashing with a sense of urgency. I've made arrangements. There's a safe house, a place where they can't find us immediately. We can lay low there for a while, but we have to go now, Jessica. The longer we wait, the more likely it is that they'll pinpoint this location. Once they do, it's game over for both of us. Jessica swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. She had never imagined that her life would take this kind of turn. Her hands trembled slightly, and she found herself glancing toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. How will we get out of here? There's security everywhere. Dr. Walker's eyes glinted with determination. I've thought of everything. Trust me, I've been planning for this. They won't be able to track us if we move fast and cover our tracks. For a brief moment, Jessica thought she might collapse under the pressure. But something inside her, something she hadn't known was there, kept her steady. There was no turning back now. She had helped Dr. Walker, and in doing so, she had stepped into a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But she couldn't just walk away. Not now. What do we need to do? She asked, her voice steadying despite the fear coursing through her veins. We'll leave together, and I'll make sure we don't leave a trace. We can't let anyone know where we're going. Dr. Walker's tone was firm. Pack light, Jessica. Just the essentials. I'll be ready in 5 minutes. As Jessica turned to leave the room and gather her things, her mind spun with thoughts of the danger they were about to face. She had always known that the world was a complicated place, filled with hidden dangers and dark secrets, but she had never imagined she would be caught in the middle of it all. And yet, here she was, on the brink of something that could change her life forever. When she returned, Dr. Walker was already waiting by the door, his face set with grim determination. He was no longer the disheveled, injured man she had found outside the hospital. Now, he looked like someone who had been through hell and back. His every movement exuded purpose, as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Ready? He asked. Jessica took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew she couldn't back out now. I'm ready. As they stepped out of the hospital room, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever this story was, it was far from over. And as she followed Dr. Walker down the sterile corridors, she couldn't help but wonder if her life, everything she had known, was about to be ripped apart in ways she couldn't even fathom. But one thing was certain, she was no longer just a nurse. She was now part of something much bigger, much darker. And whether she liked it or not, there was no turning back. Into the unknown. The moment Jessica stepped out into the cool night air, her senses were on high alert. The once familiar, comforting world of the hospital she had spent so many hours in felt like it was a lifetime away. As the heavy hospital doors shut behind them, the reality of the situation set in. She was no longer just Jessica, the overworked nurse trying to get through another day. She was now part of something she couldn't fully understand, something that could change the course of everything. Dr. Walker led the way, his movements sharp and purposeful, as if he knew exactly what to do, every step of the way. Despite the ragged state of his appearance, there was a confidence about him now that hadn't been there when Jessica had first found him. It was as if the weight of the truth had lifted something in him, something that made him come alive once again. But there was also a palpable tension in his every movement, a sense of urgency, as if every second counted. Jessica glanced around nervously as they walked quickly through the darkened parking lot. She had to force herself not to look over her shoulder every few seconds, even though she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was as if some invisible force were closing in on them. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively gripped the strap of her bag more tightly. She didn't know who they were, but she could feel the threat in the air. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with a mounting sense of anxiety. She was used to taking control in crisis situations, but this was beyond her experience. "A safe house," Dr. Walker replied without breaking his stride. "I have a few places lined up. They'll be harder to track. We need to keep moving." The sense of danger hung over them like a storm cloud, and Jessica could feel her heart pounding as they reached a car that had been parked in the far corner of the lot. It was unmarked, nondescript, a far cry from the high-end vehicles Jessica imagined someone like Dr. Walker would own. The simplicity of it only added to the unease bubbling in her chest. There was nothing normal about this situation. Nothing. "Get in," Dr. Walker said, his tone sharp, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Jessica hesitated for a brief moment before she slid into the passenger seat, the car's interior dark and silent. She watched Dr. Walker start the engine with practiced ease, his hands steady on the wheel. As they pulled out of the parking lot, she glanced out the window, the bright lights of the city fading behind them. "How do you know they won't find us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as the car sped through the empty streets. "I've taken precautions," Dr. Walker said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "There's a network. A few trusted people who've been helping me stay off the radar. It's not foolproof, but it will buy us some time." Jessica's mind raced, trying to make sense of the tangled web Dr. Walker was describing. He had a network? Trusted people? Had he been preparing for this for years? The questions swirled in her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to voice them. She needed to focus on the present, on staying safe, on surviving whatever this was. They drove for what felt like hours, the streets becoming progressively quieter as they left the city behind. The glow of streetlights faded into the darkness of rural roads, and Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. There was no turning back now. The world she had known was slipping away, and she was being pulled into something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Eventually, Dr. Walker took a sharp turn onto a gravel path, the car bouncing slightly as they drove deeper into the woods. Jessica couldn't see much beyond the dark outline of trees, but she knew they were getting farther and farther from the safety of the city. It made her uneasy, but she trusted that Dr. Walker knew what he was doing. He had to. After a few more minutes, the car pulled up to a small, unassuming cabin. It was tucked away from view, nestled in the trees, and from the outside, it looked like any other remote house in the woods. But Jessica knew better than to assume things were as they seemed. Every instinct in her screamed that they were far from safe. Dr. Walker parked the car and turned off the engine, his face tight with concentration. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, nondescript key, which he used to unlock the door. He didn't say anything as they both stepped out of the car, but Jessica could feel the weight of his tension in the air. She followed him up the porch steps and into the cabin, her heart pounding with every step. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A small wood stove crackled in the corner, and there were a few mismatched chairs and a table, but nothing that spoke of comfort or permanence. It felt like a place meant for hiding, no frills, just survival. "We'll stay here for the night," Dr. Walker said, his voice low and cautious. "Tomorrow, we move again. I'll make some calls. We need to figure out our next steps." Jessica nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. There was no such thing as safety anymore. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The truth was, she didn't know what to believe. The story Dr. Walker had told her seemed impossible, yet she had seen the desperation in his eyes. She had seen the fear, the same fear that was starting to take root in her own chest. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you come to me? There had to be someone else. Someone more qualified." Dr. Walker's eyes met hers, his gaze filled with a strange mixture of sadness and determination. "Because you're the only one I could trust," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You helped me when no one else did. You didn't hesitate. That means something. And I can't explain it all to you right now, but I need you to trust me. You're in this now, whether you like it or not." Jessica didn't know what to say to that. She didn't want to be a part of this. She didn't want to be dragged into some dangerous conspiracy involving a missing scientist, secret organizations, and God knows what else. But here she was, her life changed in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. As Dr. Walker moved toward the small kitchenette to prepare some water, Jessica sank into one of the chairs by the table. The weight of everything was crashing down on her, and she closed her eyes, trying to block out the rising panic inside her. She couldn't afford to be weak. She couldn't afford to let fear control her. Not now. But the questions kept coming, endless, suffocating questions. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, would she make it out alive? When Dr. Walker returned, he seemed a bit more collected, but the tension in the air was palpable. "We'll have to stay here until it's safe to move again," he said, his voice low but steady. "But you need to know one thing, Jessica, this is only the beginning. There are people out there who will stop at nothing to get to me. They'll come for you. And when they do, you need to be ready." Jessica looked up at him, her breath shallow, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. She didn't know what was coming, but one thing was certain, her life was no longer her own. She had crossed a line, and now, she was trapped in a world of secrets and danger. And there was no telling how long she would survive in it, the breaking point. Days had passed since Jessica and Dr. Walker had taken refuge in the cabin, and with each passing hour, the weight of the situation grew heavier. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim determination to survive. The safe house was far from comfortable, but it provided the bare minimum they needed to stay alive. Still, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, constantly on edge, as if the forest itself were conspiring against them. The days blurred together as Jessica tried to adjust to the new reality she found herself in. Dr. Walker was always on the move, making calls, strategizing, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with whoever was after him. He had insisted that she stay put, but the longer they stayed hidden, the more restless she became. The cabin's isolation was suffocating, and the walls felt like they were closing in on her. The silence was deafening, and she found herself pacing back and forth, her mind unable to rest. At night, when the weight of the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, Jessica would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind rustled the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig or the distant call of an animal would send her heart racing. It felt like there was something out there, something lurking just beyond her reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite the constant tension, Dr. Walker had remained oddly calm. He would disappear into the small, windowless room at the back of the cabin, his voice muffled as he made more calls or worked on something she couldn't quite see. He wouldn't explain what he was doing, only saying that they needed to stay hidden until it was safe to move again. But Jessica had grown increasingly frustrated with his secrecy. She had a right to know what was happening. She had a right to know why her life had been torn apart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cabin was bathed in a soft, golden light, Jessica decided she had had enough. She needed answers. She couldn't keep living in the dark, unsure of what was coming next or why Dr. Walker had chosen her. With a deep breath, she walked to the back room, where Dr. Walker was hunched over a cluttered table, papers and diagrams scattered around him. The faint glow of a lantern illuminated his face, casting long shadows that made him look older than his years. "Dr. Walker," she said, her voice firmer than it had been in days. "I need you to tell me everything. I can't keep doing this without knowing what's going on. Why did you come to me? Why am I involved in all of this?" Dr. Walker didn't look up immediately. His fingers moved quickly over the papers in front of him, as if he were trying to complete something before she interrupted. But when he finally did look up, his eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "You're right," he said quietly. "You deserve to know." Jessica's heart skipped a beat as he stood up and walked toward her, his face set with determination. She had never seen him like this before, completely unguarded, as if he had finally decided to trust her with the truth. "I didn't come to you by chance," he began, his voice steady but heavy. "You're not just any nurse. You're someone I've been watching for a while now. I needed someone who was capable, who had the right skills, and who wouldn't ask too many questions. Someone who could handle the truth. And when I saw you helping that man on the street, when you didn't hesitate to act, despite everything, I knew I had found someone who could help me. But more than that, I knew you could be trusted." Jessica stared at him, struggling to process the implications of his words. He had been watching her all this time? The idea sent a chill through her, but it also made a strange kind of sense. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask to be a part of your problems, Dr. Walker. I was just trying to do my job." "I know," he said, his expression softening. "And I'm sorry. But it's too late to turn back now. The people who are after me are dangerous. They know everything. They've been tracking my every move, and I'm sure they've already figured out that you're connected to me." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. "Who are they? What do they want from you?" Dr. Walker hesitated, as though weighing whether or not to tell her the whole truth. He let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of everything was finally catching up to him. "They're an organization. A private group with vast resources. They want the technology I've developed, the implant I put inside myself. It's not just a tracking device. It's something far more advanced, something that could change everything. They want it, and they'll do anything to get it." Jessica's mind was spinning. "Wait, you're telling me that device is what they're after? It's not just a tracker?" "No," Dr. Walker said, his voice tight. "It's a neural enhancement device. I've been working on it for years. It's a prototype, but it's far more advanced than anything the world has ever seen. It has the potential to change the human brain's capabilities, to increase intelligence, memory, and even physical abilities. It's the future of human evolution, and they'll stop at nothing to get their hands on it." Jessica felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. A neural enhancement device? Something that could change humanity's very makeup? The implications were staggering. "Why would you put something like that inside yourself?" she asked, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "I had to test it," Dr. Walker said simply. "It's the only way to know if it works. But now it's out of my control. They know what it can do, and they're coming for it. They'll stop at nothing to get it from me." Jessica swallowed hard, trying to process the weight of what he was saying. "So, I'm in danger because I helped you? Because I took care of you when you were hurt?" Dr. Walker nodded solemnly. "Yes. And now you're caught up in this mess. They'll come for you, too. I'm sorry, Jessica, but there's no way out. They won't rest until they have what they want." The air between them seemed to thicken with the weight of the truth. Jessica's mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined her life would come to this. 1 minute, she was just a nurse trying to do her job, and the next, she was caught in the crossfire of a shadowy organization, her life hanging by a thread. And yet, despite the terror and the uncertainty, something inside her refused to give up. She couldn't just walk away now. She couldn't turn her back on Dr. Walker, not after everything they had been through together. So what now? She asked, her voice steadied despite the panic building inside her. What do we do next? Dr. Walker looked at her, his face a mixture of gratitude and regret. We fight, he said. We find a way to keep the device safe, and we make sure they never get their hands on it. We don't have a choice anymore. They'll come for us, no matter where we go. But we have to keep moving. We have to stay one step ahead. Jessica nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: her life had been irrevocably changed. And there was no going back.